Hi everyone, and welcome to this detailed look at the new GeoTuner building in Oxygen Not Included. This is part of the new beta testing content just added, and I looked briefly at this and the other big changes in the summary video. Here, I'm going to look at the numbers behind the GeoTuner building and look at why it used to be so game-breakingly good. Be aware that the numbers may change before the content is officially launched. I'm also going to assume a knowledge of geysers for this video, and for a detailed look at how they work, see the geyser tutorial bite. As mentioned, I explained geotuners at a high level in the summary video. To recap that here, we can now buff geysers to improve their material output, as well as increase their temperature. Of course, this only works with analysed geysers, but once you have that, then all you need to do is select which one to buff in the building. A Duke with the field research skill will then be able to work the machine to buff the geyser for 600 seconds or one cycle. Note that this only counts down when the geyser is erupting. The material output increases by 20%, or a fifth, and you can use 5 geotuners on the same geyser to double its output, and this limit was introduced in a recent patch. When active, the geotuner will consume a resource depending on the geyser type. Therefore, the geysers can be grouped into 6 big categories, each one of which shares the same resource input type and temperature increase. I've got 2 tables here showing 3 of these categories each, and don't be alarmed by all the numbers as I'll explain each one. Hopefully the first and last columns should be straightforward. They are the geyser type and the temperature increase from the geotuner. The second and fourth columns relate to the direct impact of the geotuner as the geyser is active. To get the geotuner active cost, I've taken the total resource consumed by the geotuner to give its buff, then divided it by the 600 seconds it lasts for. Then the active output material increase is 20% of an average geyser of this type when erupting. Of course, all real geysers' outputs fall in a range near that type's average. Now the final 2 columns to explain are really the important ones. To get these numbers, I've averaged the material costs and outputs over the eruption cycle of the geysers. This is the same idea as a calculated average output, and is like asking what the numbers are if the geotuner ran constantly and the geyser output constantly. I've multiplied the active columns by the fraction of time active. Whether I've explained that well enough or not, the key takeaway is this. Using the geotuner is effectively consuming the input material at this rate and producing the extra output material at this rate, as well as the extra heat. And as I said, that was only the first half of the table, so here are the other 3 categories with their numbers. Then for those of you who want a complete reference, this is the full table. Now with the limit of 5 geotuners per geyser that was just added, this should probably be the end of the video. The geotuner is now slightly useful, but not very interesting. But before this limit was introduced, the geotuner was very broken, and I spent a lot of time coming up with cool builds to abuse this, so it would be a waste of time not to show them, even though sadly they can't be built anymore. The first was with a leaky oil fisher, and the neat thing here is that with the temperature boost, you could basically make it a leaky petroleum fisher. This is still possible with 5 geotuners, but is only just over the oil boiling point. The output is doubled to around 250 grams per second on average. That doesn't really compare to a full petroleum boiler, which can quite easily achieve 10 kilograms per second, but it is a neat idea. For a full look at petroleum boilers, you can check out the tutorial bite. The heat itself is an issue too, and unless you have a thermium pump, you'll be at risk of overheating. Either way, you would probably want to use steam turbines to take some heat out. A second cool use that was possible is superheating a volcano. This allows you to quite easily reach the maximum in-game temperature with 53 geotuners. Any higher in the game would crash, as the magma would be above the maximum temperature, so it's probably one of the reasons the limit was put in place. To make this more practical, you could have used fewer geotuners to reach any really hot temperature you wanted, to melt or vaporize a specific material. Now the hottest you can reach with 5 geotuners is just under 2500 degrees Celsius. In this example, I melted steel without much difficulty. This is now extremely difficult, but you could use this to melt other materials with lower melting points. Once the rock gas becomes too cold to be useful, you can still vent it out and collect a lot of power with steam turbines. Just beware that once cool enough it will turn into magma, and dealing with both that and rock gas is a bit tricky. And my big finale was going to be why the geotuner was so broken. There is actually a hidden cycle in the numbers, and it does still work, but isn't as exploitable. The chlorine vent can be boosted with salt, which makes extra chlorine that can be turned into bleach stone. By using this with a salt water geyser, we get water and salt back, and more than we put in. I'm only going to skim through the numbers now, and it starts with the chlorine vent and 1 geotuner. The extra chlorine is then turned into bleach stone, and is enough to run 0.78 geotuners applied to a salt water geyser. This extra water is already hot enough to immediately become steam, and 7% of that mass is salt. That means 33.5 grams per second of salt is made, so it's more than we put in, as well as more water output. With this closed loop, we've just made a free 445 grams per second of steam and 8.5 grams per second of salt, and it cost us nothing but time. To bring this into whole numbers of geotuners, that is 5 on the chlorine vent and 4 on the salt water geyser, giving a net calculated average water output of 2.2 kilograms per second, or enough oxygen for 20 dupes. Now before the limit, we could theoretically do this infinitely and get free infinite resources with temperature as the only limit. The first practical limit was machine overheating with thermium, which happens at 975 degrees Celsius. And going to the absolute extremes, the maximum you could get out of this was at the melting point of wolframite, 3200 degrees Celsius, needed for mechanized airlocks. Achieving this would create a net water output of 78 kilograms per second. Of course, I also went and built these designs, so I wanted to show them as I think they were pretty cool, even though you can't make them anymore. The first one simply used thermium and had 43 geotuners with an average output of almost 25 kilograms per second at a temperature of 955 degrees Celsius. Something I hadn't considered was the melting point of salt, which is at 800 degrees Celsius. So I had to capture this as a liquid, solidifying it in the pipes at 1 kilogram per second to stop them breaking. The other huge challenge with this was cooling, and I used 9 aquatuners with supercoolant for the 14 turbines. That means it was still just about power positive, although you could have gotten an extra 18 kilowatts by blocking 3 of the inlets on every turbine and having 42 of them. And of course I only went and made a working wolframite melting temperature design too, and here it is. This used 140 geotuners, pushing the geyser output to 66 kilograms per second on average, or 212 kilograms per second when erupting, at a temperature of 2900 degrees. Obviously this build was monstrously big. Again, I didn't think of the salt temperatures, and as it turns to gas at around 1500 degrees Celsius, I had to redesign around that too. The doors cleverly worked in a way to let the gas fall through, then create a vacuum seal in the middle. And I'm not even going to try and explain the automation here. The gas fell down and condensed against a bath of liquid salt, kept around 900 degrees. When this got too hot, I had 2 heat injectors to cool it down, and the left side of the steam room also solidified the salt for collection. Cooling this was even more of a challenge than the last build, and I used a total of 89 aquatuners, 9 of which were just for cooling the steam turbines above the aquatuners. The whole design net consumed about 55 kilowatts as it was, so you would have needed a spare sour gas boiler handy to actually run it, although that could have been increased to be power positive. It's really quite unfortunate that this is no longer possible, but it was so broken that the change was really inevitable. And so that's it for this detailed look at the geotuner building. It's a bit of a shame the limit was introduced, but I hope this was still interesting, and thanks for watching.